Rounds sliced the ravine in neat, hateful lines, as if someone had laid a ruler over the dirt and decided exactly where every man would die. The seals were flattened behind a seam of rock no higher than a boot, pressed so tight to the earth their plate carriers scraped grit. Dust hung in the air in slow curtains, each new burst punching fresh holes in it. The sound wasn't one sound, it was layers, the sharp snap of supersonic cracks overhead, the heavier thud of impacts downrange, the frantic clatter of their own rifles firing only when they could, only when it mattered, because shooting back didn't change geometry. It just burned time. Fronts locked. The point man said, voice low, breath measured like he was talking about weather. He risked an inch of helmet above the lip, saw the ridge line, and ducked before the next string found him. Rears locked too. Their team leader, Lieutenant Rourke, pulled his radio closer as if bringing it nearer to his mouth could make the world listen. Raven 1, Raven 1. This is Raven 2. Contact, pinned in ravine. Requesting. The reply was a pulsing hiss like a slow heartbeat made of static. Rourke clicked off and tried another frequency. Jaw set. Same hiss. Another. Hiss again, thicker, almost mocking, as if someone on the other side of the hill was breathing directly into their ear and refusing to speak. Jammed, the senior operator muttered. He wasn't surprised, and that made it worse. A rocket coughed from somewhere above. The launch cracked distinct from gunfire. It arced over the ravine and slammed into the slope behind them. The blast shoved air into their lungs and stole it back. Rocks came down like a sudden storm. Dust rolled through their shallow cover and turned daylight into a gritty, vibrating fog. RPG, someone yelled, too late to matter. Another rocket followed, closer. The enemy wasn't guessing. They were walking it in, nudging the explosions forward like fingers tapping a trapped insect toward the edge of table. Move's dead, Rourke said, scanning the ravine's narrow mouth. Their route out was becoming a sliding pile of broken stone. They're collapsing the exit, as if to underline it. An explosion tore into the only place the ravine widened. Dirt and rock geysered upward and came back down in a choking avalanche. A brown curtain fell across the gap, and for a second the SEALs couldn't see anything but swirling grit. "Doc, check him!" Rourke snapped. "Corpseman, Doc." Vega crawled toward the man who'd made a sound that didn't belong to bullets or explosions. Petty Officer Mays had tried to shift his legs and failed. The movement ended in a sharp, involuntary grunt. His thigh was already soaking dark, the wound ugly and deep, but not immediately life-ending. It was worse than death in its own way. It turned a six-man element into a five-man element carrying a heavy, helpless seventh thing made of bone and blood and time. "Tourniquet on," Vegas said, voice tight. "He's alive. He's not walking." Mays looked up through dust, eyes too calm, as if he'd already stepped outside his body. "Don't leave me," he whispered, not as a plea, more like a fact he needed confirmed. "No one's leaving you," Rourke said instantly, because saying it was easier than figuring out how. The point man risked another look. Glint. High ground. Left side of the saddle. Rourke shifted, careful, slow, as if moving too quickly might attract the ridge's attention. Through the haze he caught it. A bright, brief flash, sun on glass, the blink of an optic. And with that blink came a new kind of pressure, the sensation of being not just shot at, but watched. Controlled. "That's the valve," the senior operator said. "He's keeping us here. He's letting the others work." Rourke's lips moved before he could stop them. "No one hits at 3.8 clicks." He didn't say it like bravado. He said it like a boundary marker. Like if the universe had rules, that was one of them. Like saying it out loud might keep the ridge from proving him wrong. The ravine answered with chaos. Another burst. A rocket launch crack. The hiss of jammed airwaves. Then something else cut through. A single distant crack, clean and cold, different from everything around them. Not a burst. Not their rifles. Not the ridge's chatter. One sound, sharp, disciplined. And right after it, a beat of silence fell, so sudden the SEALs felt it like a hand on the throat. The glint on the ridge vanished. A shape jerked, folded, and slid out of sight as if pulled by an invisible string. The gunfire that had been kneading the ravine's lip faltered, losing rhythm. It wasn't mercy. It was confusion. The enemy had lost one of its metronomes. Another crack, again distant, again deliberate. Up on the ridgeline, a man who'd been hunched over a handheld radio, arm half raised in signal, snapped backward and dropped behind a rock. The movement was wrong, limp, boneless, final. A third crack came a breath later. One of the RPG men stood, tube lifting, and then his knees unlatched. He felt like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The SEALs froze. Not because they didn't want to move, because they didn't know what rules had changed. The air was still jammed. There was no friendly call sign in their ears. No voice saying, "I'm on you." Just those single cracks and the sudden, unnerving pockets of quiet they left behind. "Who the hell is that?" Vega whispered, half to himself. Rourke shook his head, eyes scanning, searching for a muzzle flash, a silhouette, anything. There was nothing. The helper was invisible. Enemy fire surged back, angry now, as if the ridge had been insulted. Rounds sprayed into the ravine in sloppy streams. Less controlled, more emotional. The enemy was shooting at shadows, at dust, at the idea that something had reached into their plan and snapped bones without warning. Rourke felt it settle in his chest. Whoever was up there wasn't shooting randomly. They were choosing. The enemy rifleman first, control. The radio, coordination. The RPG, movement denial. Force multipliers. One by one, the ravine went briefly quiet again, as if the battlefield was holding its breath. Rourke looked at his men, at May's pale face, at the collapsing exit, at the ridge line that still held teeth. "Do we move?" he said, barely audible. "Or do we wait for the next miracle?" No one answered. In the absence of comms, silence became the only protocol left. Hours earlier, silence had meant something else. They'd been in a forward hide that smelled like oil and cold metal, lit by a red lens that made everything look like it belonged to an old photograph. Maps were spread, creases worn into them by fingers and repetition. A remote site marked by a small square sat in a valley where lines of elevation crowded together like clenched hands. Rourke had tapped the square. "We go in, verify damage, recover the package, and get out before first light." That's it. No hero stuff. One narrow approach line was circled. The terrain around, it was a brutal geometry problem. Ridges that could see down into the valley, dead ground pockets that could hide men, and a corridor that looked like an invitation until you considered how quickly it could become a coffin. "Overwatch will be set here," Rourke said, pointing to a shoulder of rock that offered a long view. "If we get eyes on, you call it. If we get contact, you shape it." The new attachment sat slightly apart, her posture unshowy, her face unreadable in the red light. She'd been introduced with a name and a file that everyone pretended not to judge. But judgment still lived in the way the room shifted around her. "Snipers here as support." One of the operators had murmured, not quiet enough to be private. Not a decider. She didn't react. She didn't smile. She simply checked her rifle case latch, then her pack straps, then the small things that told experienced eyes how someone thought. Spare batteries taped together, not loose, water routed for quick access, a folded strip of cloth tucked where it could become shade or signal or silence. The new guy, fresh enough to still have questions in his eyes, watched her like she was a puzzle. "You always this quiet?" he'd asked, trying to turn curiosity into humor. Her gaze had lifted to him for a second, calm, not unkind. "When there's nothing worth saying," she'd replied. Then she'd gone back to her kit. To the senior operator, her calm read as unknown. Unknown in a place where everyone needed to be predictable. Unknown in a job where unknown got people killed. The comms plan had been clean. 3 primary frecs, 2 alternates, 1 emergency. Rourke had outlined it like a ritual. She'd waited until he finished, then asked softly, "And if the air goes dead?" Rourke had paused, surprised more than annoyed. "We'll push through. We'll. Fallback signals," she'd said, not pressing, simply placing the thought on the table. "Time movement cues. Visual acknowledgement. Something we agree on before we can agree on anything." Someone had shrugged. "This isn't a movie." She nodded once, as if accepting that statement as a type of comfort other people needed. On the approach, hours later, the valley had been asleep under a thin layer of wind-blown dust. The team moved in a line that flowed with the terrain, boots careful on rock, bodies shaped by practice. They passed a shepherd trail, narrow, worn, empty. It ran up toward the ridges like a question. Could be locals, Vega had whispered. Or could be nothing. Nothing's nothing, the senior operator had answered, and everyone had understood the moral edge of it. You didn't fire at nothing if nothing might be a man carrying a bundle of sticks. Rourke's last-minute note had arrived on a clipped message from higher. Extraction window had tightened. Aircraft risk. In and out. No delays. Pressure had been baked into the plan like salt in bread. You didn't taste it at first. You tasted it later when it was all you could taste. Near the site, the quiet sniper had slowed for half a step. Her eyes had gone to a line of stones that looked too deliberate, too clean, as if someone had rearranged the earth and tried to make it look untouched. A faint reflective thread caught the corner of her vision, something that shouldn't have been there, not in a place where wind and time ruled. She hadn't called it out, not because she didn't trust the team, because she trusted time more. She filed it. She held it. She waited for evidence to stack. The site itself was more than a box on a map. It was a small, hardened shelter tucked into rock, with equipment that looked ordinary until you knew what it was. Sensitive hardware. Data modules. The kind of thing that, in the wrong hands, could paint every friendly movement on a screen for months. The kind of thing that didn't just hold information, it held leverage. Worth an ambush. Worth a trap. And now, in the present, as the SEALs lay pinned in a ravine with jammed radios and collapsing exits, the quiet sniper was not with them. She was elsewhere, alone, already moving. The first hint that the corridor had become a door closing came not from bullets, but from pattern. From her overwatch position, separate by design, she watched the approach line and saw fire arrive from two elevations, not one. One set of shooters high and left, stitching the ravine lip. Another set higher still, farther back, controlling the rear with calm, spacing shots like punctuation. Disciplined, coordinated, not a gang with rifles. A unit with intent. Her radio crackled into the same pulsing hiss the others were hearing, though she couldn't see them now. She tried one frequency, then another, then the emergency. All dead, all drowned by a steady, deliberate noise. Jamming wasn't incidental. It was a curtain someone had drawn at exactly the right moment. Below, she saw the SEAL element flatten, saw the dust bloom from impacts. She saw the exit route get targeted by rockets, not random, not wasteful. Walking, the blast closer, collapsing rock until escape would require climbing under fire or running through a funnel. Then she saw one of them go down, not dead but broken in the way that forces decisions. The others shifted, smaller, heavier, slower. The enemy's fire didn't chase kills. It chased containment. That told her the truth. This wasn't about body count. This was a capture attempt or a retrieval blockade. The enemy wanted them alive long enough to get something else, or want to keep them away from something until another team arrived. Either way, the SEALs were being held in place like a hand holding a coin on a table. She found the enemy's control points the way a mechanic finds a loose belt by listening to an engine. A radio operator crouched behind cover, arm moving in crisp signals. An RPG team positioned to deny routes. A ridge marksman, patient, lethal, acting like a valve that opened and closed the SEAL's ability to move. Force multipliers. Her optic flickered a low battery warning, dim enough to be dismissed by someone who wanted to dismiss it. She didn't dismiss it. She felt the constraint settle around her like a collar. Time behind glass would have to be rationed. Every look would have to be purposeful. A small drone drifted into view for a moment. Low, cautious, searching. Not a toy, not a show, a tool. They could hunt. If she started firing from here, they would triangulate her, bracket her, climb her. Overwatch became a beacon the moment it spoke. Below, Rourke tried to break movement. He pushed a man to the left, a fast drag attempt. The enemy's fire adjusted instantly, as if someone had been waiting for that exact move. Mortar rounds thumped in, Not tight enough to kill, tight enough to herd, walking the seals back into the ravine's shallow teeth. Her angle, good minutes ago, was compromised now by the enemy's geometry. She could see pieces, not the whole. She could hit one control point, maybe two, but not the hinge that would break the trap open. Staying meant watching them die in slow motion. She made a choice so quiet it felt like a betrayal. She moved away from them. Not to leave, to save. She slid down into dead ground where the ridge couldn't see her, where the fight became muffled thunder above her head. The air down there was colder, thicker with dust. Silence lived in pockets between impacts. She moved along a narrow scree cut that forced patience. Loose rock wanted to betray her, wanted to skid her downhill with a sound that would draw eyes. She placed each boot as if setting it on glass. When she had to use her hands, she did it slowly, fingers finding perches without scraping. Visibility worsened. Dust drifted like fog. The ridges lost sharpness and became shapes. In that gray, landmarks mattered. A split boulder like an animal's jaw, a seam of darker stone, a lone scrub clinging stubbornly to a crack. She held the map in her head and the wind in her face, measuring direction the way sailors measure stars. She checked her ammo without counting loudly. Enough, but not endless. Heat discipline mattered too. The rifle could do a lot. It couldn't do miracles if you demanded miracles every second. She paused, listened. Through the muffled fight, she caught cadence. The enemy's bursts were timed, their pauses deliberate. Someone was directing. Someone with experience was controlling fields of fire the way a conductor controls strings. It wasn't random violence. It was leadership, and leadership could be cut. A memory surfaced, not a full flashback, just a fragment sharp as a shard of ice. A training range years ago, a row of men watching her set up. The weight of their doubt, not spoken loudly, spoken in the way they didn't step aside, didn't offer space, didn't believe she belonged there. A scorecard at the end, numbers that refused to match their assumptions. The silence after that, not respectful, threatened. A reminder that sometimes excellence didn't earn belonging. Sometimes it earned resentment. She'd learned then to keep her head down, to let work speak quietly, to avoid visibility, because visibility invited arguments she didn't have time for. Up here, alone, she didn't have time for anything but function. She reached a partial overlook and eased her optic up. The angle gave her a slice of the ridge, enough to confirm the marksman's position, enough to see the radio operator shift, enough to watch the RPG team reload. Not enough. The trap wasn't held by one man. It was held by a network. She needed an intersecting line, a position that didn't just see commanded. The final climb was punishing, a rock spine that rose steep and exposed in short, brutal intervals. She waited for the enemy's bursts, moved on their noise, froze in their pauses. Fear came in hot waves. What if a drone saw her? What if a spotter caught the flick of motion? What if a round found her in the open? She didn't deny fear. She let it exist like weather. Then she did the work anyway. Her comms were still dead. No rescue net. No voice. She couldn't tell Rourke she was repositioning. She couldn't say, hold on. She couldn't say, I see you. So she reached in her pack and pulled a simple contingency she'd asked for earlier and been shrugged off. Not a gadget. Not a trick. A quiet plan. A timed cue. If the air went dead, the ground could still speak. Smoke could still mean something if everyone agreed on what it meant. Movement could be synchronized to a signal even without words. She didn't deploy it yet. She held it, waiting for the right moment. The cue meant nothing if it arrived too early. It meant everything if it arrived at the peak when the team needed a push or a drag to succeed. Then she saw it. An unnatural antenna profile tucked in a guarded rock niche. A small shape that didn't belong to the mountain. Men clustered around it with the kind of protectiveness reserved for things that mattered. There was the curtain. There was what powered the hiss. Her breath slowed. Her world narrowed. She built her ladder in her mind. Not as a checklist, not as a game, like triage. Like choosing which bleeding artery to clamp first. Jammer lead, break the curtain. Radio coordinator, break the brain. RPG, open movement. Ridge marksman, remove the valve. Squad leaders, break cohesion. Crew-served weapon, in suppression. She waited. Below, the SEALs tried again to shift maze. The drag faltered. A burst pinned them. Another rocket launch crack sounded, and the ravine shook with a blast that came too close. That was the peak. That was the moment where the next 10 seconds would decide whether the story ended here. She settled into stillness, so complete it felt like she'd become part of the rock. The battlefield above didn't know she existed. That was the point. Then she spoke with one sound. A single crack, distant clean. The jammer lead, head lifted, mouth forming a command, collapsed as if the mountain itself had unplugged him. The hiss in her ear changed. Not gone. Different. The curtain trembled. Another crack. The radio operator, arm half raised, snapped backward and vanished behind cover. Another crack. The RPG gunner, lifting the tube, folded mid-motion. Down in the ravine, the SEALs felt the pressure change even before they understood why. The enemy's fire stuttered. The rhythm broke. Rourke stared up through dust, heart hammering against his plate, and caught a fragment of sound through the static. An almost voice, a flicker of clarity. Not a call sign, not a conversation, just enough to remind him the air could still carry meaning. "We've got," he heard himself say, then listened harder as the noise cleared for a half second, as if the world was offering him one sliver of truth. "We've got an angel up high." He didn't know if anyone heard him. It didn't matter. The phrase anchored him. It gave him something to move toward. Up on the ridge, the enemy reacted with a competence that made her respect them even as she dismantled them. They didn't all panic. Some did, spraying rounds at empty rock, firing anger into dust. But others shifted, crouched, signaled. A leader tried to reassert control without the radio, using hand gestures, moving men like pieces. She took that leader next. The turning point shot didn't feel dramatic from her side. It felt necessary. The enemy coordinator, half standing, pointing hard, trying to rebuild the pattern, dropped. And the enemy fire changed from controlled containment to frantic retaliation. Cohesion broke like glass. She continued. Each shot was separated by listening, by watching what changed after impact. When an RPG man went down, the ravine's exit lane stopped being bracketed by explosions. When a ridge shooter fell, the SEALs could lift their heads without instant punishment. When a crew-served gunner collapsed behind a rock, the volume of suppression dropped in a way that created space to breathe, to drag, to move. 14 times, she found a force multiplier and removed it. Not a number to brag about. A tally of problems solved under pressure. Below, Rourke seized the opening. He didn't waste it on vengeance. He used it for extraction. "Move!" he shouted, and this time the word wasn't a prayer. It was a command the battlefield could finally hear. They hauled Maze in a tight drag, bodies low, rifles angled toward threats that were suddenly less certain. Vega popped a brief concealment, smoke blooming like a curtain of their own, and they shifted to a better lane, the one the enemy had tried to deny with rockets. The enemy adapted again, faster now, because they were smart enough to realize what was happening. They stopped firing blindly. They started searching. A drone reappeared, drifting low, scanning the ridge lines like a curious insect. A pair of enemy fighters broke off and began climbing toward where they guessed the shots were coming from, using rocks and angles with skill that wasn't accidental. She felt the hunt begin as a change in the air, as a tightening, as the sense that the mountain was no longer just terrain. It was a chessboard with pieces moving toward her. Her optics warning blinked again. Battery was dying. She couldn't afford long looks. She couldn't afford spectacle. Incoming rounds snapped near her cover, close enough that stone chips stung her cheek. Someone had guessed her general position. Someone was bracketing. Her heart surged. Fear rose like fire. She didn't panic. She shrank into stillness, making herself smaller than the rock, smaller than the idea of a target. Then she shifted, only a few steps, only enough to change the angle of death. Those few steps were the difference between being bracketed and being missed by inches. The climbers got closer. She could hear loose rock slide under their boots. She could hear a low murmur, short phrases, confident, not frantic. Competent enemy. Intentional enemy. the kind that earned survival if you let them. She waited for the moment they had to expose themselves, when the spine forced them into open space for a heartbeat, when their own geometry demanded sacrifice. When it came, she took the closest threat with one clean shot. The second froze, shocked, then ducked, then tried to move again, trying to be clever, trying to flank. She didn't chase him with a flurry. She held her discipline. She watched, listened, and when he broke cover for just long enough to become real, she ended the immediate hunt with another single crack. Then she went still again. Below, the seals reached the extraction point as the sky began to lighten in the east, the first hint of dawn turning dust into gold. The sound of rotors, or the distant growl of an approaching vehicle, rolled over the valley like salvation. Enemy fire faded into frustrated distance. They were losing their window. They knew it. Rourke shoved Mays forward, hands on his plate carrier, pushing him into the arms of men who'd come in hard and fast to meet them. Go, go, he snapped, and Vega was already climbing, already pulling. As the last seal cleared the point, Rourke turned, eyes searching the ridges. Through the thinning dust, he finally saw it. A silhouette far above, small against the mountain, motionless as if carved from stone. Not triumphant, not waving, just there, absolute in effect. They were in a safe room later. If any room could be safe when your ears still rang with gunfire and your hands still shook when you tried to pretend they didn't. Maps covered the table again, but now the creases looked like scars. Voices stayed low, not out of secrecy, but out of reverence for how close it had been. Mays lay on a cot nearby, pale but alive, his leg wrapped tight, his jaw clenched against pain that would outlast the mission by months. Rourke stood at the map and pointed to the remote site. This wasn't just broken gear, he said, voice rough. It was a data node. Local network tie-ins. Sensitive. If they'd taken it, if they captured us with it, every move in this region would have been on their screen. The senior operator exhaled slowly. So that's why they didn't just wipe us. They wanted the package. Wanted us breathing long enough to hand it over. And a propaganda win, Vega added. A filmed capture. A message. The enemy's discipline made sense now. The jamming, the funnel, the containment, staged not to kill fast, but to hold, to harvest. Rourke looked toward the quiet sniper, sitting slightly apart, wiping dust from her rifle with a cloth that moved in steady circles. She didn't join the conversation unless spoken to. She didn't claim anything. She simply cleaned, the way people clean after chaos to remind themselves they can still control small things. Rourke found the line in his throat like a stone. Earlier, he said, and his men looked up. In the ravine, I said, no one hits at 3.8 clicks. A faint shift moved through the room. Part embarrassment, part awe, part the uncomfortable truth that certainty had almost gotten them killed. Rourke's voice softened. I was wrong. No one laughed. No one teased. It wasn't that kind of wrong. The senior operator, who had doubted her with silence rather than words, cleared his throat. On the way in, he said slow, you paused. You saw something. She looked up. For a second, something like reluctance crossed her face. Not fear, not shame, more like old habit. Then she nodded once. Stone line, she said. Too clean. In a thread. Reflective. Like a guideline. Like they'd shaped the corridor. Rourke felt a coldness settle in his stomach. You knew. I suspected, she corrected. Knowing and suspecting aren't the same. Not until it stacks. Vega leaned forward. And the comms contingency? She didn't smile, but her eyes showed a flicker of something. Tired humor. Maybe. I asked, she said. We agreed on nothing. So I planned for something anyway. The new guy, who'd asked why she was quiet, looked down at his hands. Why don't you talk? He asked, softer now, as if he finally understood that the question had weight. She paused, cloth still in her hands. The room waited without pushing. When you're visible, she said, choosing each word like it might cost her later, people decide what you are before you do the work. And sometimes they don't want the work to change their decision. The senior operator nodded slowly, as if the statement fit into a file he'd never admitted existed. So you stay quiet. I stay useful, she said. Quiet is just the shape it takes. Mays, on the cot, shifted with a wince. I don't care what shape it takes, he rasped. I'm breathing. That landed harder than any praise. It wasn't ceremony. It was truth. Rourke looked at her rifle, at the dust still trapped in its seams, at the cloth moving steadily. 14, he said, not as a number, but as a question. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she set the cloth down, palms resting briefly on her knees, eyes unfocused, as if replaying the ridge line and the movements and the split seconds. 14 problems, she said finally. 14 moments where the fight was being held together by one person or one tool. The number doesn't matter. What each one did mattered. The cause sat in the room with them, uninvited and undeniable. May's recovery would be long. The memory of being pinned with no comms would wake some of them at night in a cold sweat. The knowledge that the enemy had been ready in a way that felt intimate, would linger like a bruise. And for her, there was a cost too, though it didn't show on her skin. Being the reason others lived didn't automatically grant belonging. Sometimes it granted expectation. Sometimes it granted new kinds of loneliness. Rourke stepped closer, not looming, just closing distance the way men did when they wanted to say something that couldn't be shouted across the table. You saved us, he said. She looked up at him, calm as ever. I did my job. Your job, Rourke repeated, and something in his expression shifted. Humility, yes, but also respect. The kind that was earned in dust and blood, not handed out in briefings. The senior operator found his voice then, the words he couldn't find in the ravine because survival had taken all of them. I was wrong about you, he said simply. No excuses. No long speech. Just truth. She nodded once, accepting it the way she accepted wind and weather, something that existed, something that didn't change what had already happened. Outside, somewhere beyond concrete walls and steel doors, the mountains still stood. The ridgeline still cut the sky. The wind still moved dust in patterns only some people noticed. Later, when the debrief thinned and the room emptied, she remained, cleaning the rifle in silence. Not because she craved solitude, but because silence was the only place she could set down what she'd carried up that ridge. Rourke paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment. The others had gone to check gear, to call home if comms allowed, to stare at nothing and pretend they were fine. He stayed because something about the night demanded a final word. You know what's funny, he said quietly. She didn't look up right away. Funny, she echoed, as if tasting the idea. I thought the impossible part was the distance, Rourke said. 3.8 clicks. Like that was the line no one crossed. She finally lifted her eyes to him. There was no pride there, only a tired steadiness. And, she asked. Rourke swallowed. Impossible wasn't the distance, he said. Impossible was believing the quiet one mattered, until you did. For the first time, just for a second, her expression softened. Not into a smile, into something smaller. Something like being seen without being placed in a box. She went back to her rifle, cloth moving in slow circles. The sound was faint, almost nothing, the kind of sound you noticed only when the violence was gone. And in that almost nothing sound was the echo of what had saved them. Calm inside chaos, silence inside violence, function inside fear. On the ridgeline, the wind kept moving, indifferent and eternal, carrying dust across old scars in the rock. And somewhere beneath that wind, a truth settled into the men who'd been pinned in a ravine and lifted out by an unseen hand. Sometimes the miracle isn't that someone hits at an impossible distance. Sometimes the miracle is that someone does the work anyway without being asked to believe in themselves out loud.